Howdy, with this video, I want to go over the fiction terms for the first essay, make sure you understand what's going on there. All the material for essay number one's under on the content page, under material for essay number one. Right now it's down there at the bottom. Once we finish response number 6, I'll move that up. I'm doing this video on Monday, June 17th. But for YouTube video number 7, I went over the general essay requirements and the topic choices. For this one, I'm going to go over these terms. I'm going to go over them pretty quickly. I know it's a YouTube video. You can always go back and listen to something if you don't quite catch something. Or if you need me to explain something differently, be sure to send me an email and I'll do my best to do that. Let's make that a little bit bigger here before we get going. Some of these you may kind of already know. It kind of depends on when's the last time you had a literature class or talked about things like this. For some people, it may have been a few years, right? But verbal irony in literature is when the character says something but kind of means the opposite. Sarcasm tends to rely on verbal irony, right? Sometimes characters do this intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. In the open boat, the men on the boat kind of see the guy waving his coat at them from the shore, and they start getting, kind of sarcastic, like, "Well, you must think we like to see him do that, right?" A little bit of humor comes in on a very serious situation through that verbal irony. You can also see unintentional verbal irony in Jesus Shaves, the one you're reading for Tuesday. Just kind of a funny discussion about Easter means and how people celebrate it, or all the symbols that come into play from different cultures. And we start getting some verbal irony between the characters there. Dramatic irony, similar kind of thing when the opposite happens that the opposite of what you expect happens. When Louise Mallard kind of sees her husband entering the door and she's dead, and the doctors kind of go, "Oh, she died of a love that kills." You got that dramatic irony going on there, right? Same thing in the open boat. So much water, none to drink. A very, very interesting kind of situation that Crane sets up to develop all different kinds of ironies. Ambivalence, for the purpose of this class, it's only going to be when you're wavering between two meanings. Western religions, every story kind of tends to deal with ambivalence. You're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell. And there's no in between, right? It kind of depends on what you choose to do. You'll see that in stories sometimes where characters kind of have a choice, you have to choose one or the other, and we see what happens as that happens. Ambiguity is a little different. That's when you have multiple meanings. Doesn't mean like there's one that's probably not the most dominant one, but you kind of go into understanding there's going to be different meanings to this story. Nathaniel Hawthorne, and stories like The Birthmark, produces a lot of ambiguity. You get to the end, you're like, what am I supposed to do with this? All the symbolism, what's all that mean? And that's kind of part of what Hawthorne's getting at. It's like there'll be four meanings through symbols, and we have to struggle to kind of come up with what they mean. So what's this little hand on Georgiana's cheek? What's that mean? Kind of creates some ambiguity there. Mood and atmosphere, it kind of depends on the author and the short story. In A Rose for Emily, it's kind of a very gothic kind of atmosphere. This old house, this creepy old lady, the servant who never talks to anybody. It's kind of creepy, right? But you also kind of start to understand what makes Emily Emily. Somebody like David Sedaris is going to create a very humorous mood or atmosphere within a story. That's kind of his reputation and what he's known for. So just kind of that feeling you're getting from the story kind of depends on the writer and what's going on there. Symbolism we've talked about, particularly with Hawthorne. Again, a universal symbol is a symbol that kind of crosses cultures. If somebody's writing about you and the sun's setting, you better watch out. In most cultures, the setting sun means the end of something, right? The same way a rising sun symbolizes a rebirth or renewal. Conventional symbol might be specific to a culture. The cross means something in Western culture that it may not mean to somebody in the middle of China, right? Something that's specific to a particular culture. We don't always agree on these symbols, right? The rebel flag here in the South means different things to different people. Is it a racist symbol? Is it a symbol of Southern pride, or whatever? It kind of depends on the person, right? Literary symbol tends to just mean something within the literary work. A little handprint on a cheek doesn't have cultural meaning. Just has meaning only within that particular Hawthorne short story. Interesting symbol in a rose for Emily is that rose. Roses have different meanings and symbolize different things, and particularly within different time frames. Traditionally, rose kind of meant virginity, right? If you think about Beauty and the Beast, that rose symbolizes Belle's willingness to love. I can't remember the prince's name. But if somebody wrote in your responses, the rose can mean love, the rose can mean this, the rose can mean that. Hawthorne, not Hawthorne, but Faulkner kind of creates some ambiguity with that title in the story. An allegory occurs when all the symbolism kind of comes together to kind of form just a highly symbolic story that's really not to be meant to be realistic. Hawthorne short stories tend towards allegory. You have all the symbolism, you try and work it out and figure out what the meaning of the story is by the end. Aesop's fables are allegories, right? Where the symbols are kind of the point of the story, or in that case, the animals. Structure. Some stories are just basic plot structures. You get the introduction, the rise in the action, the climax, the denouement, and then you're out of the story. Other stories are different. Jesus Shaves is just a kind of collection of stuff coming at you, and you're kind of like trying to figure out where you're at in time and space. Faulkner does not employ a chronological structure to his story. You're jumping around in time. He's trying to piece all these things together. He does that on purpose, which we talked about with modernism and cubism and all that. Other people, like Flannery O'Connor, story kind of just starts at the beginning, goes to the end, and fairly straightforward structure to it. Foreshadowing is when authors give hints of what's to come. The murder of the family towards the end of A Good Man's Hard to Find is kind of set up different ways by Flannery O'Connor. They go through the towns of Toomsboro. They pass 6 or 7 headstones in a graveyard. The men come down in a hearse-like vehicle. Probably nothing good's going to happen if you're getting all that death imagery or that death foreshadowing in the story. Plot, that's what happens in the story. When I say don't give me plot summary, don't say, this happened, and 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 this happened. And they found a strand of iron gray hair. I was like, I've read A Rose for Emily. I know what happened. I want you to examine certain themes and some of these other terms. Themes, kind of the ideas behind the story. If you're looking at something like The Birthmark, this human desire for perfection and the problems it causes is one of Hawthorne's themes. This kind of anti-science theme is pretty prominent in Hawthorne. That's use of symbols. It might be another theme. All those horrible English teacher questions. What's that story mean to you? And you're like, I don't know. That's what we're getting at with the themes. Some of the stories on the list, you're going to definitely get racial themes. What happens when you're a minority culture and you have to function within the dominant culture? Might be a major theme of some of those stories. Protagonist is the main character in the story. The antagonist is kind of the second character, kind of pitted against the first character. In A Good Man's Hard to Find, the grandmother's probably the protagonist. We're with her through the whole story. We see her change a little bit, particularly at the end when she's facing death. The antagonist would probably be the misfit. It's hard to imagine being more antagonistic than shooting someone 3 times in the chest, right? In other stories, it could be a little more ambiguous. In A Rose for Emily, the protagonist is obviously Emily, but who's the antagonist? There's Homer Barron, but he's kind of not a minor character. He's kind of a minor character. Is it the entire town who's the antagonist? Is it these horrible forces of life that are the antagonist? Gets to be a little more interesting there, right? Same thing with something like The Open Boat. You might have all 4 men as the protagonists, and the antagonist is nature, so to speak, or this situation they find themselves in. These forces that work against us. It's kind of interesting to kind of work through some of that. And those are 2 good terms to be using in your essay, too. Static or flat characters tend to be stereotypes. If you think about the family in A Good Man's Hard to Find, we can't get too attached to them because she's going to kill them off at the end, and we don't be focused on that. We want to be focused on what's happening with the grandmother and the misfit. So she kind of keeps them kind of as a stereotype. We don't learn a lot about them, and then she does that, and Flannery O'Connor does that on purpose. Um, Same thing kind of with the open boat. Sometimes you don't even know which character's talking. It's just all this information coming at you through dialogue. And if you notice at some points in the story, it's impossible to tell who's actually saying what sometimes. So these characters aren't particularly developed. We don't learn a lot about them. Maybe a little bit with the correspondent. We're kind of in his head a little bit, but fairly flat characters, and realists tend to do that sometimes. Particularly naturalists. Dynamic ground character is going to be one who goes through changes. Again, like in A Rose for Emily, we see different aspects of Emily. She kind of becomes this kind of dynamic ground character. And part of the question is how do we respond to all this input that we get about her? Same thing in A Good Man's Hard to Find. The grandmother's kind of this dynamic ground character. You may not like her, but we see a lot of different sides to her, especially at the end where she's about the only one who can kind of reach out and at least try to connect with the misfit, particularly through the religious ideas that she's been taught. Sympathetic characters, a character you identify with. That really depends on the reader. Some people identify with Emily and having all these family and town, small town forces working on them. Other people just think she's a crazy woman who murdered a guy and slept with his rotting corpse, and icky. It kind of depends on who you are and what stage in life you are when you read some of these stories about who you're sympathetic towards. Point of view: who's telling the story? Do we have a first-person narrator? First person generally uses I. I did this. I did that. Trying to think, I don't think we've had one really. Rose for Emily kind of has a first-person we, where it seems like the entire town's kind of telling the story, or at least according to some critics. Quite a few critics think there's more than one narrator in A Rose for Emily because we started, with such a wide range of time there, and a lot of different things would be hard for one person to know all that information. Third person narration, he did this, they did this, we did this. Most of our short stories have been third person narrators. Good Man's Hard to Find is a good example of third person narration. You get some interesting questions about how much is the narrator participating in events. Sometimes, like with a Poe short story, you get a first person narrator who's doing a lot of the action. And The Cask of Amontillado, the first person narrator is literally leading a guy into the catacombs to murder him. And this also kind of ties into the question of whether or not the narrator is reliable versus unreliable. Can we trust the information we're getting from our narrator? Like that Poe short story, which I know we didn't read that, but if you ever read anything from Poe, this is a problem because he uses a lot of first person narrators who are insane, who commit murder or do all these bizarre things, and you're kind of like, well, can I rely on this person for information? In a similar vein, The Rose for Emily, the first person narrator isn't always reliable. They're not afraid to gossip a little bit or kind of insinuate certain things. And by the end, you got to start thinking, well, maybe these people or this narrator or these narrators only have a little bitty fragment of Emily that they're trying to impart upon us, and maybe they're not always successful in doing that reliably. So lots of interesting ways writers can play with these narrators. Very rare to have a second person narrator, the you, but you kind of get that in Black Box, the Jennifer Egan story for tomorrow. She's focused on the you. You won't know for sure until you see them crouching above you. She's talking to the reader in a way, or maybe another one is about to go through this experience. So kind of, it sounds kind of straightforward, but that narration can be very interesting to talk about, particularly in terms of the movement and the short story. Again, omniscient versus limited omniscience in the narration. How much does the narrator know? How much is the narrator willing to say? It's kind of interesting. Sometimes writers will use just a fly on the wall, just telling you only what happened. Other writers will use narrators that can go into people's heads, which is kind of what happens in A Good Man's Hard to Find. We kind of see a little bit about what's happening inside the grandmother's head, but not the misfit's head. Which makes it kind of an interesting short story. Um, Setting: where's the story taking place in terms of location, in terms of time. Some stories take place in people's heads. You don't maybe not realize that to the end. Kind of interesting things going on with the setting. Again, it might be a good one to look at in terms of your movement and your short story that you choose for this first essay. Style is going to be kind of a catch-all phrase. That's where we're getting into the question of what makes Hawthorne Hawthorne, what makes Sedaris Sedaris, or Flannery O'Connor Flannery O'Connor, or Faulkner Faulkner. Flannery O'Connor is kind of known for her grotesque, violent humor, but also doing that while examining certain religious themes, certainly examining the ideas of existentialism that are flying around her, and she's kind of rejecting them in some ways, maybe accepting them in others. But just that theme is just characteristic of Flannery O'Connor, trying to work through that, and doing so quite often through violence and really dark sense of humor there. Again, somebody like Hawthorne, you're going to get symbolism upon symbolism upon symbolism that creates all this ambiguity. Fascinating writer. That if you just look at Hawthorne's sentence structure, you would never want to diagram that, right? It's just complex, and man, you just got to work to get through some sentences. If you're going to read that Hemingway short story, to consider that for essay one, totally different style there, right? Just short, choppy sentences. Much different kind of approach to writing and what writing can do. And kind of various certain themes that can be attributed to certain authors. All kinds of interesting things that kind of make that author kind of unique and kind of sets them apart. It's kind of what we're talking about with style. I think I covered them all there. Again, I went through that really quickly. Some of these you probably already know. Hopefully, a couple of them you kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense. I've never heard that term, but now I know what it means. But again, you're going to use 5 of those in your essay. It shouldn't be that hard to do. Everybody should be able to throw in protagonist and antagonist and theme without too much trouble. You might end up using one of these terms as one of your body paragraphs. If you're going to talk about Nathaniel Hawthorne, you should be talking about symbolism. That's just the hallmark of his writing and romanticism. Same thing with the modernists. You're probably going to start talking about structure. If you look at that Hemingway short story, sometimes we're inside the narrator's head, sometimes we're in third person, and you can see the difference in the italics there within the story. Makes it for a very interesting structure. And Hemingway's pretty much another fairly famous modernist writer. But I'm gonna hopefully that covered those. Obviously, if you're having trouble with one of these terms or you're thinking about using it and you want to ask me about it, you're going to email me and maybe try to get me to explain that a little bit further. But if you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Well, I'm going to get off here. Bye bye.